Yeah, I think there's a lot that's happened since the GFC that has, affected millennials. Obviously, it's been a very difficult time to come of age. It's a difficult time for all generations. One of the things you see happening, though, in today's economy is that the professions and job types showing the greatest growth have been jobs that have been traditionally associated with female roles. We call this the pink collar economy, and that's actually been a tailwind for millennial women. If you take a look at the BLS list of the jobs expected to have the highest growth over the next 10, 20 years, almost all of them are kind of female job roles, everything from public relations to health worker to nurse and so on, going down. The blue collar jobs are traditionally male, are showing declines. So in that sense, you might say that this has been good for women relative to men. I think the reality is, though, that it's actually put more pressure on women because it's harder to find a man, quite simply. I think a lot of the anxiety facing women now is not just the anxiety of being successful in their own professions and successful career-wise, but also trying to adapt that to family life and finding eligible men. I think this is one of the reasons why you see a really bifurcation between college and non-college, which is arguably even more meaningful for women than for men. Non-college women, more likely to have children earlier, a lot less likely to get married, which means they're going to be stuck in a life where there's very little advancement, very little security, which means there's a lot more focus on making sure that you're credentialed, making sure that you have a successful career in your own right, even if you do want to someday choose a family, because you're not going to be in the same circles. One thing that people often talk about today, in fact, is the rise of what's called assortative mating, which is that men and women are increasingly marrying people of their own educational rank, right? And this is contributing long-term, maybe even to socioeconomic inequality. In the old days, there used to be the stereotype of the CEO who would marry their secretary. There's a lot less of that today. And so you have high-powered professionals or people who are educated in the same circles having kids, and then you have other people having kids. So you see a greater likelihood of generational transmission of being well off or being poor off. So I think the idea of making sure you're successful early in life, and I would say this report really puts a focus on how well women have adjusted to a world where long-term planning and making the right choices at an earlier age empower you individually in the economic marketplace. This is a generation of women who are having children, particularly out of wedlock, dramatically less often than Gen Xers or Boomers at the same age. In fact, from peak to trough, from peak in the early 1990s with Generation X to today, there's been a 60% reduction in teenage pregnancy. So a lot of those early decisions that certainly didn't help women in the long term are being avoided by millennials. Secondly, they're getting educated much more thoroughly. In fact, millennials are now out-earning men in every level of educational attainment, meaning they're more likely to graduate high school, they're more likely to get bachelor's degrees, they're more likely to get master's degrees, and they're now more likely to get PhDs. And thirdly, this is a generation which, particularly in young adulthood, in their 20s, maybe just a bit past age 30, are closing the wage gap with like-aged men. So, among millennials, the female to male ratio of earnings is about 90%, certainly higher than it was for Xers and Boomers. And among married millennials, the share of women out-earning their husbands is around 29-30%. Again, about double what it was certainly for Boomers. But again, with that increasing success comes anxiety, particularly as millennials get older. They begin to make choices about their family lives, And then, of course, the question is, well, we still have very traditional assumptions about who bears the role in family life, right? And then millennial women have to think, do I have the time? Can I maintain my role as an achiever while still having a family? And can I find a man, a millennial man, who is capable of stepping up to the plate and supporting me? That's a bigger problem for millennial women than it was for Xer women and boomer women the same age. The conflict of a generation of women, which on the one hand is putting more pressure on themselves to be achieving in the workplace, out-earning the men, out-credentialing the men on the one hand, but on the other hand, feeling earlier than men the compulsion or the necessity or the desire to actually take a role in family formation. I think this is enormously stressful. I think men are feeling their own stresses, particularly more in the economy and the ability to achieve when so many of the male role model jobs are disappearing from our economy. But I think overall, this puts a great deal of stress on women, and we see it in many of the things outlined in this report, namely suicide, overdoses, and a lot of backtracking or a rise in some of the substance abuse issues, which I will say overall, the millennial generation has caused an enormous reduction in. So we should keep it in perspective. But I think you see this among women. And just to give you an example, this wasn't in the report, but if you look at the popularity of basically prescribed amphetamines, these are things that are treated, used to treat ADD in school, like Adderall and Ritalin and so on, legal amphetamines. You see a tremendous increase in the number of millennial women in their 20s and 30s. According to Express Scripts, this is the single largest increase of any kind of prescription drug over the past 10 years is women in their 20s and 30s using these drugs. Why? Well, they're doing PowerPoints for their bosses at 3 in the morning, right? They're trying to achieve in ways which, some of the men in their lives aren't. So again, that's the stress they feel. Social media is weighing negatively on millennials of both genders, in my opinion. There's a lot of discussion of this, particularly surveys showing that people who are on Facebook a lot tend to be more depressed. That should be an indicator right there. Doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It's probably a little bit more severe if you're a woman, because we know that more women spend relatively more time on Facebook. That may be simply because women are more socially inclined. They think more of their social ties. Whereas, you find a lot more men who say, I'm off the grid. I never go there. I'd rather not compare my life with others. But this is a little bit of what older generations have always experienced in the Christmas card. I'm sure everyone's gotten these. The Christmas card where your cousin or your uncle or someone in your family writes about all the wonderful things they've done all year, and all of their kids have all gone to Ivy League schools, and you're flying around the world and you're living this wonderful, successful life. And everyone who receives that Christmas card basically just hates you, right? They all just want to kill you for that. Well, this is now what we have every day on Facebook. Right? You have this idealized life which you show, and basically the idea is to make you feel good, but you make you feel good by making everyone else feel worse, right? So there is a little of this. There's a lot of competition going on. Millennials are a social generation. I mean, they're the ones, along with Mark Zuckerberg, who invented the whole idea of social media, leading a fishbowl existence where everyone can look at you all the time. You're under your own identity, not an avatar, so everyone knows who you are. And there's a lot of pressure there. And that's another cause of millennial stress. They want to look good in the eyes of everyone else. This is a cause of many good things about millennials. One of the reasons why they're more risk averse, why they're less aggressive, interpersonally. They like to come across as nice and well adjusted because they know they're always being judged by their peers. They want to fit in. but there's a lot of stress because you're always comparing yourself to the idealized lives of others, and you're always figuring that you're not quite up to the standard. And that's probably a little bit more of a problem for young women than men. One long-term consequence of the growth of pink-collar occupations, that is to say, occupations which have traditionally been associated with female roles, is that it's provided a great tailwind for the millennial generation of women. And it's one of the reasons why women are doing so well, so much better than earlier generations of women, and indeed doing a lot better, and by many measures, than the men in their lives, right? Than guys their own age. Young women between the ages of 18 and 30 is the only demographic which has caught up fully with their employment to population ratio that they had before the GFC in 2007. All other demographics, right? Men of all age brackets still remain lagging behind. But young women, particularly women who are not yet married, right, are totally up where they were before the GFC, partly because there's a lot of demand for the kinds of jobs that women have traditionally filled. Now, part of that, of course, is a reflection of some of the stresses in our economy. A lot of these traditionally female professions, and we've mentioned a few of them, like public relations, teachers in education, social service workers, a whole slew of people-oriented healthcare professions. These are in fields, or I should say industries, which have been experiencing very little productivity, which is why they are increasingly large as time goes on. One of the problems with men is that they've made the things that they do, like blue-collar industries, so productive that you don't need any people in them anymore, right? So the total labor force in those areas is declining. There are no new openings for young people. What this will mean is, and something we've written about, is that you're going to find a lot of men going into traditionally pink-collar professions. A lot more young men now going into nursing, going into teaching. We think in the future this could actually lead to a kind of a masculinization of traditionally female-oriented jobs. We had actually the opposite of that back in the 1890s and around the turn of the century, the early 1900s, when jobs that used to be done by men, like teaching and secretaries, right, became dominated by women coming into the workforce. That was particularly the generation born just after the Civil War. All these women wanted to go into professions, and they took over these things that were dominated by men. We may actually find over the next couple of decades a reverse movement of men actually coming back into these more service-oriented and somewhat more people-oriented professions been traditionally associated with women. I think another interesting thing to speculate on is the changing relationships between men and women with regard to the kinds of roles they're looking for. One thing that's certainly impressed me as I look at, talk to a lot of millennial women and what they're looking for from men is a striking contrast from what a lot of people noticed back in the 1970s when boomers were young adults, and particularly 70s and 80s. I think a lot of boomers recall back then the whole idea of what used to be called the Alan Alda male, right? Sweet, sensitive, willing to express their emotions, less oriented on getting ahead and being a success necessarily in the workplace, willing to spend more time emotionally, being a little bit more vulnerable and open with women. This was very popular back then. A lot of movies made on that that kind of theme, and I think that was kind of how you would have characterized what boomer women are looking for, kind of a sweeter, sensitive, more, less driven guy. I can tell you that is totally gone. I mean, I've spoken to a lot of young millennial women, and what they're looking for is definitely not that. What they're looking for is a guy who's willing to achieve, step up to the plate, get the job done, right? And take some of the burden off her. You have a lot of millennial women today who are under tremendous stress to push themselves ahead economically. And what they're really looking for a little bit is not just a guy necessarily who will help them, and they're certainly looking for that, help them with raising kids and starting a family, but they're also looking for a guy who can actually step up to the plate and take some of that economic stress of being the provider away from them. And this is a striking difference. I've often said a little bit, I don't know, semi-facetiously, but that young men always become, sooner or later, maybe with a lag of a few years, what young women want them to become. Sort of, most young men spend a lot of their daily time thinking about how they can impress young women. And so I think that may be a leading indicator of where millennial men may be going. Just looking at that as sort of a guiding light of where they're being told they need to put their energy. So that's something we can look forward to. It's very interesting that the GI generation that won World War II and came home from the war turned out to become, after that event, a very super masculine generation in midlife, with very wide distinctions between male and female roles in the families of the 1950s, certainly much more so than anyone remembers them being in the 20s and 30s. Be interesting to see whether or not millennials might follow that same evolution of actually experiencing a little bit more division between gender roles as they grow older, certainly more than you're seeing today among millennials in their 20s.